Hello and welcome to the webinar on how to implement and verify biodiversity conservation activities in organic agricultural systems by Joanne Baumgartner of the Wild Farm Alliance and John Quinn of Furman University. This is your host, Alice Formiga from the eOrganic Community of Practice at extension.org. Today's presentation will last approximately 2 hours, and we will have several short breaks in between for questions. I'm very pleased to welcome our presenters today. Joanne Baumgartner of the Wild Farm Alliance is from Watsonville, California. The mission of the Wild Farm Alliance is to promote a healthy, viable agriculture that helps to protect and restore wild nature. Much of her work focuses on conservation education and advocacy in organic agriculture. We also welcome John Quinn, who is an assistant professor of biology at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. John's work focuses on biodiversity conservation opportunities and the benefits of these actions in agricultural ecosystems. I'd also like to acknowledge Sarah Brown of Oregon Tilth for her help in organizing this webinar, as well as Western SARE, which provided the funding for it through a professional development grant. So with that, I'm going to hand over the microphone to our first presenter, John Quinn.
Thank you, everybody. And as you can see here is kind of a brief outline of what we're going to cover over the next hour and a half to 2 hours. Each section has a particular focus, and there will be an opportunity for questions at the start. I'm going to talk during sections 1, 3, and 5, and then Joanne will step in and talk during sections 2 and 4. Okay. What we want to start with broadly, though, and part of what motivated this is the new guidance from the USDA, in particular as it relates to biodiversity. I want to talk about what biodiversity is and allude a little bit about why you should care as farmers. And I'm going to start with myself as a conservation biologist. So I come from a training and perspective of a first primary goal is protecting biodiversity. However, my research and interest really align with agricultural systems. The simplest reason for that, as Wendell Berry says the best, is conservationists, and in fact everybody eats. So this is a fundamental question for conservation biology and learning how to work with farmers. And organic farmers have really been at the forefront of trying to find this balance between food production and species and biodiversity conservation. A second reason that this is so important to work with farmers and organic farmers in particular is the fact that approaching 40% of terrestrial ice surface is dedicated to farming and food systems. This is a map of global croplands lumped together, rangeland and cropland. But we can see the clear extent. And if we are, again, going to work to protect species, we really need to focus on agricultural lands. This nice graphic from the National Geographic summarizes it well. We can see here that large portion that is pasture land and cropland. And so this is a need, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about what some of the needs are. If we're talking about what biodiversity is, there are multiple definitions out there, but at its broadest extent, we can think of it as a sum total of all variation from genes to ecosystems. So we think about genetic diversity. These are the different traits within different crops, within different wildlife. We can think of species diversity, and this is often what we look at in a particular ecosystem. So we'll say, how many bird species are there, or how many different plants. We can also think about this in crop systems. And then finally, ecosystem diversity, which includes the biotic and abiotic components, but then also the processes that they support, so the function that we receive from species and ecosystems. We can define and work with biodiversity a little more explicitly. We can first think of the idea of associated biodiversity. My focus is typically birds as one example of this, but these are lands typically not deliberately managed by a farmer. It might be species or habitats at field edges, on the perimeter of the farm, and the species that move between those and farm fields. Planned biodiversity, on the other hand, are the components that a farmer will manage on a day-to-day basis. So what crops am I going to plant this year? What is my rotation? Should I include livestock, and what species? And some of these questions can occur over longer periods of time. So should we include windbreaks in a farm? That's the sort of planned biodiversity that requires, a 10, 20, 30-year time horizon to work under. These, looking a little bit more specifically at the three scales of diversity and why they're so important. Genetic diversity, particularly in croplands, provides the traits that researchers work with to find new varieties. The picture on the left are some of the organic wheat trials that the University of Nebraska-Lincoln ran for a number of years to look at could we develop organic specific varieties suitable for baking but also suitable for organic production. The figure on the right highlights the economic value of that genetic diversity as compared to some of the other benefits we get from ecosystems. And you can see the blue bar there shows how valuable as far as the direct benefit of provisioning service genetic diversity is. In some respects, more economically important than food production in and of itself. Species diversity, this is where it includes both planned and associated. So we can think about the birds that you see on the left side of the screen, that move through the margins, that cross the fields, that may provide some pest suppression, that definitely provide aesthetic beauty, acoustic beauty, where people really enjoy that landscape. And then we can see the species diversity across the farm here. This is a farm in eastern Nebraska with different strip cropping going across the farm. And then some of the other species, you can see the trees, the grasses associated with the margins. When we're talking about actually measuring diversity, there are some very specific terms that get used. Biodiversity often gets mixed up with the idea of richness, so that's just strictly the number of species. But in an applied sense and from a conservation and ecology in our field, we have some terms that are useful for communicating what biodiversity is on the farm. You can think of richness as the number of different species present. And so if you look at sample A on this figure, there are 3 different species, so the richness would be 3 there. You have the monarchs, the dragonflies, and the lady beetles, versus sample B has a richness of 2. Abundance is the number of different individuals in a population, and so you could say there are 6 monarch butterflies in that population. Those both communicate different things about biodiversity on the land. Evenness is another interesting one to consider, and this is the balance in relative abundance across different populations, and so the sample B is a very even population. There's 4 butterflies and 4 ants as compared to sample A, which is less even. Lastly, you'll see people talk about different diversity indices. These combine the previous 3 measures to paint a more complete picture. All of them have value, but I think it's really important to think about when you're talking about diversity, what specifically are you communicating? And ultimately, when we get out to that larger scale, we have to step out, use satellite imagery, think about bigger scale questions. And this is one of my favorite images that captures the beauty and complexity of ecosystem diversity on farms. These 6 different images each represents a different farm ecosystem. And that ecosystem, that diversity here reflects both ecological context, but also economic and cultural context. So the figure at the top left is a Minnesota. It was taken in Minnesota. You can see the nice township range sections, the perfect mile squares. You move to the right there, you can see the center pivots in Kansas. Further right again, the small fields in Germany, and so many more years of farming and kind of breaking up that land. You drop down from the one in Germany there, you see large fields. This is production in Brazil. Moving to the left, Southeast Asia and rice production, and then finally Bolivia is the image on the far left, where you have windbreaks providing a perimeter around a particular piece of land where people farm in the middle and live in the middle. What I love about this is it says that agricultural systems are complex, and trying to understand or paint one picture of a farm ecosystem is really hard to do. But it's also a beautiful thing, and so we should celebrate the fact that agriculture is an ecosystem. when we start thinking about maintaining biodiversity, we should think about local and landscape diversity, and so I like this figure because it talks about where we can put nature, where we can put planned and associated biodiversity in the landscape. On the far left, we see, nature is the green dots kind of scattered across multiple different farms of each one of those squares. Maybe nature can be condensed within a single farm, or maybe a group of farmers can work together, as we see on the far right, kind of collaborate and have conservation efforts embedded within within different farms and that collaborative effort at larger scales. And really, when we start talking about biodiversity, and at the end of this I'm going to talk a little bit about monitoring biodiversity, you have to be clear at what scale you're monitoring. And so this is a nice figure summarizing some of the scales we might measure biodiversity at. So you could say, what's the species richness of insects within a particular plot? Or you could say, how does species abundance vary between two different fields? Or does one farm have greater evenness than another farm? Aligning what you measure with what scale it is helps communicate across farms, and ultimately makes for higher quality data to both report in the certification process or track change over time. And then ultimately, when we start articulating why biodiversity is important, we can talk about the idea of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are the benefits that we get from nature. This includes everything from carbon sequestration to pest suppression and pollination. They have an estimated value of $145 trillion per year. These are direct benefits that we get both from planned and associated biodiversity, and ultimately that diversity is influenced by the human landscapes, including agricultural areas and the natural areas that they're embedded within. The reason we have to consider ecosystem services is that even though we've done really well with food production doubling in the last 50 years, it's come at the expense of a lot of other ecosystem services. And so as managers of 40% of terrestrial ice-free surface, ecosystem services are a really important aspect of why biodiversity is important. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joanne and give her an opportunity to talk about the biodiversity continuum.
All right. Thank you, John. Let's see. Okay, the biodiversity continuum. I'm going to describe some of what is in this publication, how to conserve biodiversity on the farm, actions to take, and a continuum from simple to complex. Complex farm ecosystems help to support those ecosystem services like John mentioned. They help to support the biodiversity, the pollinators that provide pollination, for instance. They also help to support native species, some of which may be rare, and help to reduce climate change impacts. The National Organic Program, i.e. the NOP, published the Natural Resources Biodiversity Guidance this past January, and when they published that, they also published a response to public's comments on their draft that they had put out earlier. And in the response to comments, they make it clear that their guidance and the rule is about more than just maintaining soil and water quality. It's about conserving biodiversity. So in the continuum of complexity, we're going to start with soil life, then go through to soil cover, talk about water, nest, shelter features, then flowering plants, native plants, adding some structure and composition to plants, and linking that together with corridors. Soil life is super important and can be increased by the additions of soil by the additions of organic matter. And with that, there's improvement of soil tilth, reduction of erosion, retainment of nutrients, there's buffering of pH, promotion of plant growth, improved water quality, water infiltration, and water holding capacity. Organic matter is one of the foundational practices when it's when it's applied in the soil as a practice, that's important for organic agriculture. And that organic matter, for the most part, we're thinking about improving the beneficial microorganisms of the soil. But there's other organisms, macroorganisms, like this native bee. It's a ground nesting bee, and it needs areas that are non-tilled and well-drained. Non-tilled areas can also support amphibians and reptiles and other kinds of beneficial organisms. Reduced tillage can help increase soil microbial mass. It helps with better nutrient cycling, better tilth, better disease suppression, and there's more storage of carbon in the soil, and there's less carbon emissions because there's less tractor passes that are using fuel. Soil cover helps to filter pollutants, helps with filtering pathogens and pesticides and nutrients. And soil cover, now we're moving through the continuum, getting a little more diverse than just taking care of that soil biodiversity. So predaceous beetles need soil cover. They live in the duff, but on top of the soil too. And predaceous beetles are incredible at helping with production. They eat weed seeds, they eat a diversity of pest organisms like aphids, cabbage root maggots, Colorado potato beetle larvae, codling moth larvae, snails, slugs, various fly maggots, and they also support beneficials like damsel bugs and snake flies during part of their life cycle. Keeping the soil covered as much as possible can also occur in livestock operations, like through the use of managed grazing, where the focus is not just on production of the livestock, but keeping healthy forage there that covers the soil, and also managing livestock so their access to sensitive areas, particularly riparian zones, are restricted or at least monitored to ensure that the soil is covered as much as possible. Okay, moving along the continuum, now it's more than just soil in the ground or biodiversity in the ground, and on top of this soil we're starting to include more features in the landscape, like providing water and nest and shelter. This image on the left shows habitat for tunnel nesting bees. On the right, farmers can allow birds to build nests under eaves or support bats. They can also supply clean water sources for drinking and bathing. Some farmers put up barn owl boxes or perches for raptors that help to reduce rodents on the farm. I've seen some farmers put up smaller perches for songbirds like this ash-throated flycatcher on the right, which catches insects in the air. And other farmers are saving the prunings of orchards to create brush piles that are nesting sites for ground nesting birds and or places, secure places for amphibians and reptiles and other kinds of beneficial organisms to exist on the farm. Providing water for more than just the production is a good thing to help support wildlife and the other native plants in natural areas on and around the farm. But that means that reducing water use may be part of the picture, especially in places where there are droughts. So selecting forage plants that are appropriate for the climate in livestock operations and or increasing irrigation efficiency with drip and microsprinkler can help with that. And creating ponds, when adhering to state and federal regulations, can provide habitat for wildlife like this turtle. But maybe farmers don't have the ability to create ponds. Maybe they just have livestock watering troughs. And those can be great sources of water for wildlife, although they can also be death traps. NRCS has created this really simple escape ramp, which you could create yourself, that helps birds and bats and salamanders and other organisms that get in these troughs to get back out. Moving through the continuum now, we're talking about planting flowering plants, so getting even more intentional. Planting sequentially flowering plants, nectar and pollen can be interspersed in crops, or flowers can be provided by retaining at any time at least one field with a flowering crop or cover crop. Flowers support lots of different insects. They support predators and parasitoids and bees, and it could be all on the same plant, like this Xerces slide. And habitat is really important for lots of organisms. As we're learning, it's especially important for monarchs when there's too much glyphosate-tolerant crops grown, as is the case in the Midwest. We're seeing that that's partially responsible for decreased milkweed habitat and then decreased monarch butterfly populations. So farms can plant a mix of flowers like these at the ends of crop rows, and thereby supplying a balanced and extended food supply for pollinators both before and after the crop blooms. They can plant flowering plants along ditches that hold the soil in place but have multiple benefits of also supporting pollinators or other beneficial insects. Okay, so now we're moving into even more complexity using native plants. More than half of the world's wildlife are insects, and 99% of them do not cause harm. 90% of the native insect herbivores specialize in native plants and related plants in 1 to 3 plant families. And why that is important is because that means that 90% of the food that's available for other organisms that eat are these insects. So to think about this a little bit more, the monarch has specialized on milkweed. They co-evolved. The milkweed got eaten by the monarch. The milkweed then put out more toxins, which then the monarch evolved to be able to digest and so forth. And while they got really good at eating milkweed, it was at the expense of not being able to eat lots of other things. So they specialized. And because 90% of the insect herbivores specialize, that's a lot of the food on the planet. They are one of the bases of the food chain. They're so important to keep everything functioning, that they are eaten by rodents and birds, and then those organisms are eaten by others and so forth. Non-native ornamental plants were selected by the nursery trade to not be attractive to insects, and so they offer little food value for insects and the animals that eat them. In this image, you might think, without looking at it closely, that look, there's habitat on that farm, that's great, but it really depends. If it's non-native ornamentals, they most likely have little habitat value for wildlife. So why is it important for production? Well, the tachinid fly on the left will attack cabbage loopers. So we want them around if we're planting cabbage or cabbage-related plants. Well, it turns out this tachinid fly will also attack the oak moth on the right, and the oak moth will be present if there are oak trees. So having that alternate food source available means the tachinid flies are going to be there when you need them to be there. You might think that having all these native plants means you have all these eggs, and is that okay? I mean, farmers, there's lots of pest insects out there. Well, in this research, they looked at what are the insects that are living on California native plant hedgerows. And while there are pest insects, there's a lot of beneficial insects that help to control the pest. Getting a little more complex is adding structure and composition to the habitat. That means lower canopy, mid canopy, and upper canopy. And different organisms live in those canopies. As you can imagine, there's ground nesting birds, there's middle layer nesting birds, and birds like hawks that want to hang out at the top of often hang out at the top of a tree. 96% of land birds in North America feed their young insects. So that's a lot of food. And you know, while birds sometimes have a bad rap, it's really just a few birds that are a problem, species of birds that are a problem for agriculture. And even some of those feed their young insects. So they might be good for agriculture during part of the season. It's a matter of life and death for their offspring if they don't catch enough insects, according to Doug Tallamy at the University of Delaware. So these chickadees, when they're feeding their nestlings, need to catch between 400 and 600 insects a day for 16 days, which equals about 6,000 to 9,000 insects to have their brood successfully fledged. That's a lot of food. And if they only have non-native habitat available, they're not going to be able to do it. So, but why are chickadees important? Well, this chestnut-backed chickadee is raising its young in an apple orchard, and they glean codling moth larvae, like the picture inset there, off the barks of trees. So do many other arboreal birds. Different parasitoid species overall were positively associated with the amount of riparian and other natural habitat near the farm. So this structural diversity is important for them too. And riparian and hedgerow habitats, they have woody vegetation in them. They store, in this study, stored 18% of the farm's total carbon despite only occupying 6% of the total area. So they're helping with climate change. And corridors, our last piece of this complexity, is helping to knit together all these different kinds of small flowering habitats or bigger pastures that have plant cover to native plants and hedgerows and riparian areas. Or the riparian areas actually are one of the habitats that can be a corridor. So can hedgerows and windbreaks, and so are grazing under woodlands like this silviculture picture on the bottom right. The importance of corridors is that they help to make connections for wildlife, reducing the genetic bottlenecking impacts from habitat fragmentation. Having farms next to natural area means there's greater diversity of native bees and increased pollination services. So you might think that you would have to fence out some of this wild nature, and it's true, sometimes wildlife eat the crop, and there have to be fences, and that can close off corridors. But it's good to open those up when the production isn't happening, lay down the fences or open up the gates for several reasons. And one is, besides connectivity and less genetic bottlenecking, it can help open up the area to predators that would keep ground squirrel populations down, because otherwise these fenced areas sometimes have high levels of rodents. Sometimes in livestock operations, the operator feels they need to reduce coyote numbers. Well, there's implications across the landscape when that occurs, because in this situation, raccoon populations increased, and then the blue-gray gnatcatcher populations decreased because the raccoons were eating all the nestlings. But just recently, I got an email from somebody in the Northeast where they were saying how coyote were being persecuted in a certain region, and because of that, the numbers of the foxes increased, and the numbers of chickens that were getting predated by the foxes increased. So it was becoming a headache for the chicken producer. So it's complicated, and just meaning having those corridors available for carnivores to move through the landscape and allowing their existence in the landscape helps to have a functioning ecosystem on the farm. But managing increased diversity can have its problems. So before selecting native plants, it's good to check with experts and see if there are problems with any of them. In this picture, fire blight has attacked this apple tree, and while there are some apples that are resistant to fire blight, if a grower had non-resistant apples, they shouldn't plant the California toyon shrub because it can support fire blight. So knowing those kinds of, there's very few native plants that I know of that are a problem, but knowing which ones are is a good thing to check out. Another potential problem with managing increased diversity is food safety. But it turns out that Congress, when they wrote the Food Safety Modernization Act, told FDA that they cannot write rules that conflict with organic regulations. And FDA's rules that came out last fall said that they do not require fencing out wildlife or taking out habitat near crops or in waterways. What they do require is monitoring for animal feces. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about this. But you could check out, you can go to our website to the resources section and find many publications about co-managing food safety and conservation. Another issue, obviously, is will the wildlife are eating the crop or the livestock. So sometimes there just has to be precautionary practices used, like netting these grapes to keep out the non-native starling, and or using predator-friendly practices to protect livestock, like using guard animals and or using electric fencing, flashing lights, putting vulnerable animals in at night, making unpredictable appearances, and keeping records of when livestock are harmed by wildlife. So they actually know how to manage for that wildlife. And I just wanted to point out, this is a brand new publication from Wild Farm Alliance, hot off the press yesterday, and please check it out. Download it at wildfarmalliance.org. It's called Biodiversity, Conservation, and Organic Farmers and Certifiers Guide, and has many examples of how to comply with the NOP's natural resource and biodiversity guidance, which I'm going to get to in the second part of my presentation. But now we can break for questions, and then John will take it up.
Okay, if anybody has a question and you missed the beginning, you can just type a question into the question box and hit return. And if it's closed, sometimes a little plus sign or triangle next to the word question, and that opens it up. We don't have a huge number yet, but right now you had referred to a beetle that eats potato beetles. So somebody wanted to know what kind that is or what the most beneficial beetles to provide for are.
Well, they're predaceous ground beetles, and there's a few different species. Oregon State University has some really good information on that, and if you want to email me, I can put you in touch with the researcher there. Email me at info@wildfarmalliance.org.
Okay, thank you. We have another question about whether there are any special difficulties with problems on flower meadow installation.
Oh, flower meadow. Well, it really depends on if the native seed bank is still there or not and will come back with some care, or if you're starting from a weedy non-native seed bank and need to first make sure you get rid of those before you plant native flowers. And let me see, there's a Western SARE publication on that that I could send you all, but basically they talk about different ways of using organic practices, such as solarization, where you cover the land with plastic. It heats up under there and kills weed seeds. But there's other ways to deal with having a good seed bed. There's also, it's possible that with mowing and or grazing, you can deal with any weeds that come up. And it's really critical to use those practices at the right time when the wildflowers are up, or the weeds are up, but the wildflowers aren't up, or the wildflowers have seeded. You don't want to mow before then, and so forth.
Okay, yeah, we're getting some more questions. Someone is interested in knowing where you source your native seeds from. I think that was, yeah, that was, or starts.
Or starts. Yeah, that's a good question. It depends. You need to find native seeds and or plant material from your local region, obviously. So I think there's some, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation has some information on finding that around the country. But if not, if it's not so specific, just look for native plant nurseries. Yeah, go ahead.
There's also, I know there are local companies and national companies that have seed mixes that are specific to regions. Back in Nebraska, there were a number of conservation groups that maintain seed banks that would sell those seeds for a profit. I know there's a same in Iowa. Here in the southeast, there are both statewide native plant groups, but you can also go online and buy region-specific wildflower seed mixes that do pretty well.
Okay, someone has a question about whether there's a website where you can find a variety of profiles of farmers of different types, like grains, applying good wildlife conservation practices. It's helpful to see and hear from actual farmers and how these practices have worked for them. Is there one farm that you've seen that illustrates many of the principles you've outlined? I know I've seen something like that, possibly on an NRCS organic website or an NRCS website, and when the presentation gets back underway, I'll do a little searching, and if I find what I'm thinking of, I'll send it along to everybody. But Joanne, do you have any input on that, or John?
Well, I would suggest getting the book Farming with the Wild by Dan Emhoff, and he went to 25 different states interviewing mostly organic farmers about how they're integrating conservation practices and wild nature into their farms. And he's a really good writer, and it's an engaging book. And I think you can get it for pretty cheap these days.
Okay, I'm typing the title there for anybody who missed it into the question box there. Okay, let's see. Okay, it says you mentioned the conflict between the FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, and organic farming rules, and that Congress instructed it not to conflict with the NOP rule. Is there an official document with this instruction? And should organic farmers be calm knowing that everything we do is in compliance with the NOP will also be in compliance with the FSMA or can be defended against it?
Well, the Food Safety Modernization Act instructed FDA what to do, so I'm pretty sure unless that act gets changed, FDA can't conflict with organic regulations. That said, we're going to find out if it holds water, so to speak, because while the FDA published produce rules last fall and they don't conflict with organic regulations, one of the things that they had proposed but didn't put in their rules had to do with the waiting period that needs to be in between applications of manure and the harvesting of the crop. And for now, the NOP 90-day, 120-day waiting periods are fine with FDA. But they're spending lots of time and research and dollars to try and figure out if that is good enough because they had proposed much stricter waiting periods. So we'll see, but for habitat, I don't think it's going to change. What they came up with was it really doesn't matter what is around the farm. What matters is that there's no feces contaminating the crop, and so that's what farmers have to manage for.
Okay, this is a comment here. Livestock fencing has different size squares from top to bottom. When inspecting vineyards, I've suggested that people flip the fence so that the larger openings are at the bottom. Only large animals need to be excluded, like deer, elk, and bear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And then maybe you could let in some of those mesopredators that may keep down the rodents.
Okay, question about, can you talk about rodent issues after the establishment of shelter belts and brush piles besides birds of prey and trapping?
Besides birds of prey and trapping, well, I know in one case a hedgerow was put in and it was near ground squirrel population, and ground squirrels, as you probably remember, stand up on their hind feet. They like to see where they're going. So do prairie dogs. And if you make it so they can't see where they're going to go, they won't go there. So what an easy solution was to put up a plastic fence, like a solid black plastic, not heavy plastic, just flimsy plastic fence along that hedgerow, and they quit having any damage to it.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question here, and then we'll probably continue, but we will have some additional question breaks. Coyotes populations have increased in recent years in the Midwest and eastern U.S., displacing the native red fox. Which canine predator is most important to have here? We saw our first coyotes in Wisconsin in the 1970s, and our fox population was high. Now seeing a red fox is rare, and coyotes have taken their place.
I'm not a carnivore biologist. That's interesting to hear about. I would think that you know, ideally there would be predators around that are keeping the coyotes in check, like wolves, and I know there are wolves in some areas up there, but not everywhere, and that's the problem. Wolves and or mountain lions can help keep coyotes in check. So without those, it is possible that there could be too many coyotes, but killing coyotes has its ramifications too, besides what I described earlier, in that they have evolved to have some higher predator keep their numbers down, so much so that when we people kill them, they reproduce much faster than they would otherwise. And it's, if possible, it's much better to train coyotes that are existing around the farm, i.e. with electric fences, with scary guard dogs, than kill them and keep on having new individuals coming to the farm causing trouble.
Okay, I think we're going to move on right now. I'm going to hand things over to John again. John, are you with us there?
Yep, I'm
okay,
here.
Great. Okay, yeah, John. Okay, here we go. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Well, and I'll just comment on the coyotes and foxes there. I think this is one of the challenges when we think about how do we design agricultural systems or how do we design landscapes after they've been radically changed. There's all sorts of research looking at the impacts of songbirds, infectious diseases, small rodents, when mesopredators, whether it's coyotes or foxes, get swapped out and their abundance changes. And so this is, I would, an active area of research, and depending on the ultimate goal, you may get a different result. And so fantastic question that hopefully science will provide a little bit more data for soon. Ultimately though, predators are important, especially those top predators. Losing top predators is part of this broader biodiversity crisis that I want to speak to here briefly, because that maybe is why we might argue that we need conservation on organic lands. These are 4 different species that have gone extinct. 2 years ago was the anniversary of the death of Martha, who was the last passenger pigeon, Tasmanian wolf, and off the coast of Australia. These are just 4 species that have gone extinct in the last 500 years. And if we look at a global scale, the U.S. in particular in the last 500 years is one of the main perpetrators of species extinction. And extinction is the complete loss of a species, not decline in abundance, not rare, but complete absence. And so 259 species lost in the last 500 years. It's also interesting to look at this in terms of cropping diversity, and this is some loss of biodiversity in cropping systems. This is the 41st parallel from Colorado across Iowa, and we can see the loss of different crops that were planted. Beans have faded out, oats have faded out, sugar beets largely replaced by corn, hay, and soybeans. And so we see a declining diversity in that context. And I think it's also interesting to think about the genetic diversity that's available, and so we're losing the wild relatives to important crops. One of the projects I talked about earlier with wheat breeding, they went to the historical land, I believe it was Turkey, looking for wheat varieties. But if those hadn't been protected, we wouldn't be able to find the important traits, the genes that we can use to breed drought-resistant wheat in the future. And so ultimately, this is important because we are in the midst of the most recent mass extinction. This is a nice infographic here summarizing the percentage of species that are threatened by different taxonomic groups, so we can see a small portion of birds, more mammals, even more amphibians. We can look at flowering plants in particular, reptiles, arachnids, insects. All these different groups have large portions of their populations that are threatened with extinction. And this is ultimately the need that drives the requirements for the biodiversity guidance. You can think about it in a more abstract term. An ecologist, G. Evelyn Hutchison, talked about we should work to maintain all the actors of the evolutionary play. So when you talk about coyotes and foxes and raccoons and small mammals, they all have a role. Trying to understand what that is and how we maintain those is one of the big challenges, rather than simplifying the system. Aldo Leopold also spoke to this idea of maintaining the whole, that we as humans are just part of the ecosystem and we have to learn how to respect it and how to work with it. So we looked earlier at the number of extinctions. We can also look forward and say, okay, we have lost species. And it's only predicted to get worse in the near future. So we can look here, the number of threatened or critically endangered species in the U.S. about matches what we've already lost, and even larger in other parts of the world. More specifically to farms, and this was a nice paper that came out actually this year, looking at the likelihood of change and bee abundance. And so the areas in brighter red represent areas where the abundance as a population size of bees have declined. This has important implications for crops that require pollination, and also those wildflower meadows if we want to try and maintain those. So even if we did plant the right seed mix, if we don't have the right species to come back and maintain those in the species interactions and important relationships, that wildflower meadow won't be successful. And Paul Ehrlich, and I think it was Brian Walker, talked about this idea of how many species can we lose. I liked, and they compared it to the ideas of rivets on an airplane, but I like the idea of thinking about it of Van Gogh's painting and how many blues can you lose before that painting is not as rich and as important, as beautiful as it is. Because yes, species extinction is a normal process, but at some point it crosses that threshold too far. In the same way, how many rivets can we lose off an airplane? I like to joke, when you use this example, think about the next time you're taking a flight, you're walking out onto your airplane and you see a rivet on the ground. Would you get on that plane? Perhaps. If you saw 2 or 3, it might change your mind. So we start thinking about how many species we can lose, reflect back on Van Gogh's paintings or on an airplane. Ultimately, though, even taking it past that kind of abstract idea, the truth is we are losing more species today than we ever have before. The normal background extinction rate is about 1 species per 1,000 per millennium. So species do go extinct. No one should ever argue that that's not the case. However, today, we could look in the area in green, that rate in the U.S. of 259 species in the last 500 years and elsewhere in the world is about 2 orders of magnitude greater than that background extinction rate. And given current patterns and current trends, it's only projected to be greater. So we can, ultimately, we'll be losing species faster than we can, than their replacement rate. And ultimately, if we think about why this is important, there is the intrinsic value of a beetle, the intrinsic value of a bird, but we can think of biodiversity as a key indicator of the safe operating space of our planet, where if we extend beyond that safe operating space, humanity in and of itself is at risk. So this is work by Rockström and their group in Stockholm, the Resilience Center. Green buffers at the core here suggest this amount of change that can occur on a planetary scale for any different parameters, everything from change in land use and freshwater use. But if you look, there's 3 processes where we've crossed that planetary boundary. The largest one by and far is biodiversity loss. This suggests that we need to take action and that farming systems, in particular organic farming systems, need to be part of that solution. I think we were going to break for questions here, but we just did. Joanne's going to step in and talk a little bit about the guidance.
Yeah, okay. So in this section, I am going to talk about the NOP's natural resource and biodiversity guidance. What's in it and how is it applied? First, I wanted to give a little background on the NOP regulations and engagement and tools that help interpret that guidance. Back in the end of 2001, the NOP regulations were published. And in 2003, IOIA, the International Organic Inspectors Association, came to us asking if we might help them with trainings inspectors on the biodiversity conservation elements of the regulation. So we worked with a broad base of organic and conservation experts to put together the publication on the lower left in 2005, and we also worked with the National Organic Standards Board during that time. That they are the guiding body for the rule, and they incorporated a set of biodiversity inspection questions into their model organic system plan. Since then, we have, excuse me, we've been engaging with the NOSB and encouraging them to make recommendations to the NOP, which they did a few times. And in 2009, they made a comprehensive recommendation to address biodiversity conservation. The biggest thing that came out of that was this guidance that came out in January of this year, but also some other important steps that the NOP has taken based on their suggestions was the NOP has their own organic system plan, and they've updated it twice to include biodiversity and natural resources. The latest one on crops is really excellent, and they need to have one for livestock. But in any case, they also included the natural resource standard in their accreditation checklist they use to accredit certifiers. So those were some really big steps. And then, as I mentioned, we published this Continuum guide this year and just published this biodiversity conservation guide. So what's in the NOP's guidance? Well, there's these different topics: purpose, scope, background. In policies and procedures, there's three roles: the roles for certified operators, the role for certifiers, the role for inspectors. Then there's some references, and in the appendix, there's a great example of activities. So what exactly is the guidance talking about? It refers to 205-200 and the definitions 205.2 to say that operators must maintain or improve natural resources, including soil, water, wetlands, woodlands, and wildlife. The definition of organic production, it says that you must conserve biodiversity, and the preamble to the regulation says that producers must initiate practices to conserve biodiversity and to show compliance in their organic system plan, which is like a farm plan. So the scope says that maintaining and improving natural resources in organic production necessarily encompasses a range of conservation principles, including but not limited to protecting riparian areas, supporting native species and habitat, minimizing invasive species, promoting crop diversity, and improving soil condition. Operations must describe in their OSP activities that comprehensively conserve biodiversity by maintaining all the natural resources: the soil, the water, the wetlands, the woodlands, and the wildlife. And operations have a responsibility to implement, monitor, and maintain practices, and during the inspection, the inspectors must verify the accuracy of that implementation and monitoring approach as described in the OSP. Operations can refer to conservation plans and implementation developed in conjunction with government and non-government in order to fulfill part of their organic system plan. So if an operation is in the U.S. and or its territories, they may have participated in USDA natural resources conservation activity like conservation planning, CSP program, Conservation Stewardship Program, or the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, EQIP. and they can refer to those for part of their OSP. Here is the NRCS a website URL, nrcsusda.gov/organic, where you can find out a lot about how NRCS helps support conservation. In order to get their help, you have to be a producer working in agriculture. And some support, they'll help anybody, but for funding, it's a competitive process. But there's lots of support there, lots of different programs that help organic, and a couple things I wanted to point out was you can get this cool brochure which talks about the EQIP Organic Initiative. And you can find out about NRCS's CAP 138, which is this handout from NRCS. And CAP 138 is, CAP stands for Conservation Activity Plan. And it was created to serve as an OSP to address organic requirements for those operations that are transitioning to organic. And they've created it so that it can be substituted in place of a traditional OSP. In the appendix of the guidance, there, as I mentioned, there's lots of good examples that operators and inspectors can get ideas from, and it covers activities such as soil composition, soil stability, water quality and quantity, supporting and coexisting with wildlife, native species and natural areas, invasive plants and animals, and crop and livestock diversity. So records are required, obviously, and it's best that the operation keep records that make it easy for the certifiers to verify compliance. So those records as related to conservation could be limiting livestock access to waterways, or visual observation, or including conservation maps, where you or draw where the hedgerows are and the riparian areas and the flowering plants and flowering areas of your pasture or healthy natural areas. And as part of the on-site inspections, certifiers are ensuring that the inspectors are observing the conservation practices implemented or reviewing records that support that implementation. The NOP guidance also talks about adjacent non-organic land, that operators that have that land that they manage and that directly benefits organic land can be described in their OSP. And then the inspector may consider that as meeting the requirement if it directly benefits the certified land. There are exceptions. The NOP realizes that there can be catastrophes that are out of the control of the operation, like damage to the ecosystem, and which might be extreme climatic conditions. The NOP says that they will be looking at the familiarity of the certifier with this guidance and how it's applied into the future. Inspectors must be qualified and able to recognize and evaluate areas where natural resources and biodiversity are already conserved, conservation projects are planned, and improvement is needed. Now we're going to go through some examples of differences between a minor issue and a major issue when not maintaining wildlife and their habitat. So a minor issue could be resolved by the operator putting in their OSP that instead of mowing plants, rare plants, before they set seed, they're going to mow them afterwards. It's something that's easily taken care of, and it doesn't require a corrective action plan. Whereas bulldozing a wetland is is not allowed, and it would require a corrective action plan to spell out how the bulldozed wetland will be restored, which is complicated. And here's a difference between minor and major issues for not maintaining water quality and, by extension, the health of wildlife. So the OSP could be changed to state that instead of irrigating too soon after manure application, which then would pollute the river or waterway and potentially impact aquatic species, they'll put in their OSP and follow through that they are not going to irrigate right after that application, but there will be a waiting period. Whereas applying manure to frozen ground is a major issue, and it will require a corrective action plan because the farm is probably putting that manure out in the winter because they have an excess amount of manure and they need to figure out how they're going to use that manure wisely, so spell out their crop and fertility system so they don't need to apply it to frozen ground. Here is the differences between minor and major issues when not maintaining wildlife. So it's about predators, and instead of killing a predator and not recording it and not having any record of it, by making that record and putting it in the OSP, then the operator shows that they are consciously trying to figure out who is it really that coyote that's causing the problem? Did the livestock fall over a cliff or die of some disease, and or maybe the neighbor dogs got it, or maybe it wasn't a coyote. You could tell by different way an animal is killed if it is killed by a mountain lion, for instance. So keeping track of that is all part of the process of managing wildlife and coexisting with them. Whereas this major issue, where the operator just kills every coyote that's out there, is not working for organic systems, and a corrective action plan will be required to spell out how the producer will use guard animals or put vulnerable animals in overnight, or other techniques that they will try before they kill predators. Another difference is between a minor and major issue related to not maintaining riparian habitat. And in the picture on the left, the livestock is in the riparian area. The operator can state in their OSP that they're going to monitor their livestock when they're in the riparian area, and that's easily correctable. Whereas on the right-hand side, the riparian area has been denuded, and so a corrective action plan is required where it spells out how the area will be restored, if grazing should even be allowed, and if so, what time of the year, the length time, the number of animals grazed in that area. Another example of the differences between a minor and major issue when not maintaining natural areas of the operation. In the image on the left, the invasive species, this is pampas grass, is in a small area on the farm, and the operator puts in their OSP how they're going to deal with that invasive species and continue to monitor for it, and it doesn't require a corrective action plan. Whereas the picture on the right, where the invasive species, this multifloral rose, has pretty much covered the natural area, it's going to take a big effort to get that under control, and so a corrective action plan will be required to spell out how to do that. What it means to conserve biodiversity and maintain natural resources on degraded land. So for instance, imagine a farmer obtains a new piece of land and there's nothing there but the soil. So can they maintain that, and that's good enough, that's maintaining natural resources? Well, no, because part of biodiversity is natural processes of restoration, and that occurs when the soil seed bank and seeds brought in from wildlife germinate, and the process of this restoration occurs naturally when allowed. So, but what about those plants that come up? Maybe some of them are weeds, i.e. weeds are plants that we don't want there for one reason or another. Maybe they're invasives and we need to deal with them, or they support pests or diseases and we need to remove them. But some plants, non-native plants, hopefully natives come up, especially in riparian areas, they often do, and prairie systems that still have seed banks. But if they're non-native, some non-natives may support may have good functions for holding soil in place and or even support wildlife such as pollinators at a certain point of time in the production cycle. So maintaining or improving natural resources and biodiversity should occur on each physically separate non-adjacent parcel of the operation. As an example, if an operator has 4 parcels and 3 of them are protecting natural resources, but the 4th parcel has an erosion problem, then it's pretty clear that this issue needs to be fixed. Similarly, if there are 3 parcels in compliance, but the 4th is not maintaining or improving wildlife, then it's an issue. There should always be some habitat on the land that supports wildlife. It could be a sequence of cover crops, infield habitats, or adjacent buffers. Maintaining or improving all natural resources is required throughout the production season. So imagine a different farm has dealt with erosion and supported biodiversity for most of the production season, but there's heavy rains in the spring that cause gullies, so they have to deal with that, and there's no habitat present to support wildlife when the crop is planted. So a farmer can alleviate the problems with a fall planting of native grasses that also include wildflowers in a filter strip. So in this example, it's kind of following up on that last point. There's no habitat on the image in the left. And on the right, the flowers were planted at the same time as the crop. This is alyssum, and you can kind of see there's a lavender phacelia has been planted with that brassica crop too. And here's a little bit more about food safety. I talked about earlier, produce buyers sometimes misguidedly have food safety requirements that impinge on the NOP regulations, and they do not override maintaining or improving natural resources. Besides monitoring for animal feces in the crop, producers can do other things that help them with that management of wildlife. For instance, they can have dirt roads, i.e. bare ground between the crop and the hedgerow, and look for tracks of wildlife moving in. I know some farmers do that. Some farmers put up a small plastic fence to keep out smaller wildlife, like ground squirrels I mentioned earlier, and sometimes farmers have to put up large fence, and usually that fencing has already, or hopefully that fencing has already had to gone up because say deer were consuming the crop, because fencing is really expensive. Hopefully it's not just because they're coming through the field. So we're still going to take questions, and John is still going to speak a little bit later.
You mentioned that taking down fences when crops weren't in danger or trying to keep flowering plants all season, but are there other ways to deal with migratory nature wildlife?
There's one. There's one farmer that I work with. We were actually at his farm yesterday, and this obviously isn't the approach for everyone, but he plants enough for everybody. Is kind of how he views it. You're never going to keep them all out, and so maybe thinking about it in that context. That might not be the best answer, but that's how at least one farmer does it.
Yes, I have actually spoken with many farmers that do that. Some call it tithing to the wild, where they lost a turkey to a mountain lion or two turkeys. It's okay because they have really good electric fencing, but the mountain lion figured out how to climb in a tree and jump over it. So once in a while it's okay. Obviously it can't be too expensive. Yeah, just supporting all kinds of wildlife, supporting their needs. Some wildlife need shelter, and cover crops can provide that, and or even hedgerows can provide shelter. And I mentioned earlier, water is really important for wildlife. Having access to that will help them as they move along the path.
Okay. Regarding operations and monitoring their plans to improve and maintain biodiversity, how can an organic certifier provide clients with resources for designing and maintaining a monitoring plan?
Part of that is the last part of the talk. We'll talk about monitoring. That's where we're working on some tools that we have from University of Nebraska, and then with work from the Organic Center, effective ways for farmers to monitor, to in some respects build on the recommendations for what to do from the Wild Farm Alliance, and then to have planning and monitoring tools in place that are easy to use for farmers and certifiers.
Okay, the same person says that she comes from a research background, and my interpretation of monitoring plan might be more akin to an LRDP than something appropriate for an OSP. I'm not sure what all those acronyms mean. I know OSP is Organic Systems Plan. I'm not sure what a LRDP is, but maybe you do.
I don't.
Okay, all right.
I don't.
Maybe the questioner could type that in, because we don't get all the acronyms here. Oh, Long Range Development Plan. There we go.
I think this is an area that the multiple different disciplines have different things, and what we're trying to do is, I think, closer to include some long-range planning and integrate that with the organic system plan. We're focusing on biodiversity right now, just because that's where our interests and experience lie. But I would think that the tools that we're going to present next talk about, defining your objectives, setting targets, choosing indicators, and then monitoring those over a period of time. So I'm not quite sure what the formal LRDP is, but I think one of my goals is to help farmers have tools to have a longer range plan than just the organic system plan, where you can say, check a box if you do things that benefit biodiversity.
Okay. Do you know of anywhere that has resources on this subject in Spanish? We had a couple of people wondering about that.
You might, OCIA, I know they do coffee, and so some of these, they might translate some of the resources. Especially, I think they also do bird-friendly coffee, so there might be some things related to biodiversity conservation there, but not nearly as thorough as what Wild Farm Alliance has.
We have one small brochure in Spanish on biodiversity, so if you wanted to email me info@wildfarmalliance.org, we could send you some of those.
Okay, let's see. Given that industrial chemical commodity extraction is responsible for so much biodiversity destruction, how can these standards be moved to the Farm Bill or otherwise tied to subsidies?
That's a fantastic question. I would argue back to the idea of payment for ecosystem services, where right now we pay farmers for food, but if we can pay them for water quality, if we can pay them for conservation of sediment, for protecting pollinators, for maintaining viable bird populations, that's how it happens. That's a really hard thing to do, though, because ultimately, how do you what are suitable baselines for payments? In Europe, they have a whole group of agricultural environmental schemes. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. I mean, there's broad reviews of that. So, yeah, I think that is ultimately needs to be a goal. There's also some questions and that is there a time and a place for that intensive agriculture if it spares land elsewhere? Again, the data isn't conclusive there as to if one is better than the other, but it's or what I would say is organic is part of the solution in terms of providing the best evidence of how conservation can be done, and if we can continue the research on organic yields, organic practices, and how we don't always compare organics to conventional, but say what can we take from organic systems and transfer that to conventional systems for conservation that has low opportunity costs, that might be an easy way in.
To add to that, the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, while they don't pay for direct water quality, they do help support farmers putting in practices that protect water quality, that support pollinators and other kinds of beneficial organisms. So the Farm Bill is a place to make that happen in a much bigger way than it has, and in the last couple of years, we, in collaboration with many sustainable organic groups around the country, worked together on a project to help NRCS better serve this community. And so I think as you saw, there's an NRCS web page on organics now, and some other programs I haven't even mentioned that they are starting to be a place for all organic farmers to at least check out, and hopefully many will work with them.
Okay, do you want to continue for a few more questions, or keep going and then have more questions at the end? Or?
I could talk now real quick, and
okay,
I mean,
yeah, we have about another half an hour or so. So let me just hand you over the screen controls, and hopefully they'll work a little better. I don't know what happened there, but okay, here you go, John.
Okay. So the last part I want to talk about here, if we think of the guidance, the need for certification, the need for deliberate action on the farm and the ability to demonstrate change, we want to talk a little bit about some of the monitoring tools that we've been working on for the last couple of years. I have a couple of things to kind of get us to that point. One, and Joanne has touched on this nicely, it is about trade-offs. And if we even going back to the question of, can we transfer organic principles to chemically intensive systems? If we start thinking about give and take, it does occur. And so what our challenge maybe is in all of this is to think about how do we manage the trade-offs, how do we do our best job to mimic natural ecosystems while maintaining food. And so John Foley has a really nice figure that kind of gets us to that point where we look here at natural systems, we move towards intensive croplands where they're affected at crop production, but none of these other benefits. But then we start thinking about maintaining a diverse landscape. How then do we kind of track this change when we've gone from just monitoring yields and reporting that to starting to talk about water quality, to talk about biodiversity, production more broadly? Especially when we start thinking about a more complex landscape. This is a nice figure that Chuck Francis from UNL put together showing, this is, on one level, a relatively simple system to monitor. It's basically yields. You can also argue that it has a lot of negative impacts where run off into the stream, there's a lack of habitat. And when we envision a slightly different system, it does become more complex. And so our goal is to perhaps provide some monitoring tools for that. one set of slides that somehow didn't make it in earlier that I want to bring up here real quick is the reason why I am so interested and so passionate about working with organic farmers is consistently the number of projects looking and comparing organic to conventional systems and seeing how they benefit biodiversity is large and numerous. And consistently there is a positive outcome for biodiversity, whether depending on whichever taxa you're looking at. Very few negative outcomes and then some where there's no difference. So I think from a research and science perspective, we can comfortably and accurately say that organic farming benefits biodiversity. And it benefits biodiversity in a meaningful way. So it's not just a few more species here and there, a little bit greater abundance. One of my colleagues working in Nebraska, she showed that there were 2 times as many birds on organic farms and 2.5 times as many species. We can see similar increases here for plants, microbes, birds, and arthropods. So there are more species, and so the question then, how do we translate that to conventional systems is a really important one, and I think communicating the success of organic, talking to your neighbors, is a great way to do that. Ultimately, to do that well really requires some planning, and so we think of what are the elements of planning and how do we implement conservation, because it does take time, whether you're restoring a wildflower patch, trying to get mesopredators, or even putting up a windbreak or a grass strip to benefit birds. You do have to think about it in a very deliberate way. So we tend to think about the planning process. One, what are your broad objectives? What do you want on your farm? You can't have it all. 2 of my favorite farmers that I worked with were about a mile apart, but their lands were just completely different, and one set of priorities wouldn't have worked for the others. Secondly, we need to define and implement those actions, and this is where the work from the Wild Farm Alliance, I think, is really powerful. Tons of recommendations on things that can be done. Ultimately, though, we want organic farmers to record the actions that they do and track that change. That's how we're going to communicate to non-organic farmers, or I would argue communicate to conservation biologists who are skeptical that farmland is important, that this benefits, that there's meaningful change, and then ultimately we want to monitor that change over time. So it's not just a snapshot of a year or 2. That fits in really nicely with some of the ideas of adaptive management, and I would argue that farmers are the original adaptive managers, where they make a plan. You can think of the organic systems plan. You can think of any farmer. They do it. They evaluate in a particular, after that year, what worked, what didn't. They learn from something new, they might adjust and do it again, and ultimately make some sort of action. What's interesting is if you look through the broader, at least in the conservation planning literature, a lot of people say they're going to do it, so upwards of 95%, but only 5% of projects actually go through and deliberately collect that data. That is ultimately really powerful to implement successful conservation. So our goal is to see if we can't come in and help make that process a little easier. There's 2 tools that are readily available for organic farmers. One's a little bit older. We started the idea of the Healthy Farm Index back in 2009. We really see this as a farm scale monitoring tool focused on first biodiversity. So what should a farm maintain? So should it maintain bird diversity, insects, plants, soil microbes, all those things along the continuum. But then I'm also starting to think about how can biodiversity benefit the farm. And so we can think about this in the context of biodiversity for agriculture, whether it's windbreaks, pollinators, and things like that. If we put that into our broad planning process, what are our objectives? What are the values? We want to protect biodiversity. A more objective, less value-driven statement might be we want to conserve plant and associated biodiversity, and we want to monitor that change over time. From an ecosystem service perspective, what do we want from biodiversity? We want improved soil quality. We want satisfaction from the land. We want to maintain food production. What we have with the Healthy Farm Index is a group of indicators broken into our different levels of biodiversity and different types of ecosystem services, where a farmer can go through, they can set their individual targets. Those targets can be based on the past data they've collected from their farm. It could be talking with regional neighbors. It could be talking with the NRCS. It could be talking with SARE, maybe the organic certifier as a whole, but something realistic for that particular farm. The structure of the indicators and the Healthy Farm Index really encourages farmers to sit through and sit and think about what are all the components, not just yield and not just bird diversity. That's kind of why we had those green, because we started there, but then we realized it's a much more complex system than that. By doing so, you're starting to track that whole system and looking at how, when you change one component, so you take out coyotes, how might plant diversity change? As kind of an example that came up earlier. It could also be, I put in cover crops. How does that system change? Last year, with support from UNFI and the Organic Center, we put the Healthy Farm Index online. So it's now an online calculator that can be used to generate a report. In the next couple of weeks, we'll be able to actually, we're going to update that so you can go through and print that report out. And it's a great way to track that change over time, especially if you go through and set targets or indicators for some point in a 5-year horizon. Say this is where I want to be, and then you track that change over time. The key thing with this is it is farmer-centered, it is farm scale, and it is farm specific. So it's not about comparing one farm to the other. It's not really about payments for ecosystem services to say I've done this. It's a tool to say this is where my farm is now in terms of current, this is where I want to be in some time horizon, and then a very organized and meticulous way to track that change over time. In response to the guidance, and because the Healthy Farm Index is very holistic and inclusive, we're working on a second calculator, a little bit simpler planning tool that's going to be a really well-defined and aligned with organic certification. So this would be a tool that a farmer could use to set those targets specifically about biodiversity. We're going to set the indicators to align with the standards. It'll be connected back to specific categories. So it'll be really easy for the farmer to use and to share with the certifier and say, here's what I'm doing, here's the current state, here's the actions I've taken, here's the change this year, and then just update that on an annual basis. We're interested in this for a couple of different reasons. First, if we can make reporting about biodiversity under this new guidance better and cleaner, I think that'll hopefully incentivize and motivate people to participate in organic or to maintain their farms for biodiversity. The other aspect is there's good evidence that participating in a monitoring practice actually increases adoption of behaviors. And so again, how can we get more farmers to have cover crops? How can we get more farmers to maintain grass strips or large contiguous areas of high quality pasture or forests that benefit biodiversity? Ultimately, education isn't enough. You need some manipulate some of the antecedents of behavior, and monitoring definitely does that. So that's going to be what we're working on that actively right now, and I'm going to share a link that perhaps we can share more broadly. It's a blank page for now, but that calculator is something we're actively working on, and hopefully it'll be a tool for farmers and ultimately for certifiers to maintain biodiversity, monitor biodiversity, and report what they're doing over time. Alrighty, I think with that, that's kind of all of our information, and that leaves 20 minutes there for questions.
And let me ask another question here. Many of the slides and conversations appear to be about areas and regions with a fair amount of water. Can you speak specifically of the challenges and opportunities in desert regions?
Well, I know in the southern central valley of California, where it's pretty arid, I think they get 5 inches of rain. There was a project I was following for several years where they put in hedgerows, and what they were using is desert plants, and they had different trials of, well, they collected the shrubs, the seed of the shrubs, and then had different trials of how to best get them to germinate. In any case, they did get them to germinate and had success with growing these desert shrubs. So I think it depends on the ecosystem, but there are plants for every ecoregion.
Okay, this you referred to in one of the slides, but here's a comment about it. Protecting riparian areas can be a catch-22 in some instances where managed intensive grazing can actually help improve the stream area for native trout and other species. Is this allowed in the guidance document?
Yes, I think in the regulation they talk about how there has to be a grazing management plan, and it has to address riparian and wetland areas. So it doesn't say you can't have livestock in there. You just have to, a producer has to describe how they are going to manage those areas well to keep them healthy. And it's possible that some areas should never have livestock because they're just too sensitive. In other areas, it's possible, like you said, that you're managing for trout, that you would want to have livestock in there. And other times, it's possible that in certain situations, they help keep out some invasive species. So it depends. It really, the producer should write up, their goals and thoughts about how to do this. And if they don't know, it's good to outreach to others who are also other producers that are also trying to figure that out, or conservation organizations in the region.
And I would say this is where, too, I mean, it depends on the targets. What are you trying to accomplish? So if you're trying to increase trout habitat, that is one question, versus if you're trying to maintain riparian habitat for a different function. This is where, having a plan, being deliberate, communicating that, tracking the data will make that effort much more successful than just saying, oh, this is an absolute.
Okay. Are there NOP sample organic system plans available online, do you know?
Oh, that's a really good question. It filled out plans. I'm not familiar with any. If others that are listening know of any, please write that into the question section.
Okay.
That would be useful.
Yeah, it would be. If anyone knows about that, please feel free to share the link. Okay, someone says, fabulous presentation. Not much has been said about the social ecology of the farm, which should probably be part of consideration and conservation of biodiversity. Education, CSAs, farm tours, farm worker relationships. I can think of many ways that social relationships might support and enhance biodiversity.
So I'll speak to that a little bit. My research group here at Furman, we're actually working on that right now. We are, because I would agree. In the Healthy Farm Index, we have a small component of that. We have a measure of tenure and a measure of satisfaction as kind of that social capital. What we're interested in is how, if you improve that social capital, if you build those relationships, how does that change behavior? This is kind of, I alluded to when we were talking about the calculator, the biodiversity calculator. The idea of the antecedents of pro-environmental behavior is really that social side. So I 100% agree. I don't have the data yet to speak to it, but I think there's a good, strong literature more broadly in agriculture and conservation about the steps in between that make it more likely for conservation to occur. So maybe we'll have a webinar next year.
I agree, and it's really important to any kind of conservation that's put on the farm to include the farm workers in that, because too often the farm workers are not knowledgeable about native plants, and they fill them in, or they weed them out, or they drive over them. They just don't understand the value. But once they do, they help take care of them. And another social aspect, one farmer we worked with to put in many conservation practices was in part doing it because he had a CSA and had his customers visiting the farm, so wanted to be able to show how he was taking care of the land, and that helps him keep his customer base.
John, there's a little bit of confusion about the link that you sent about the conservation guidance compliance tool. Someone looked at it and it links to an almost blank page. I know the tool isn't completely developed yet, so are they in the right place, and is that where they should go to
They're
find?
in the right place.
Okay.
That should be there soon. We have the link out there, and so bookmark that and check back in a month. I got 4 students and myself are all wrestling with that to get it done as fast as we can.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, I emailed both. I mean, I put both
Okay.
in the chat box, the conservation compliance tool as well as the existing Healthy Farm Index calculator. So I just wanted to clarify that for everyone here.
Yeah, it is. It is blank. We're not
okay.
fast enough.
It's not done yet, but it will be. So okay, good. All right. There was a study about repopulating wolves on the eastern coast, capturing and neutering and spaying them, and then releasing them to prevent coyotes repopulating the wolf. Okay, wait. This long sentence here. The wolf numbers increased, but when the study stopped, then coyotes started displaying the red wolves. In other words, they interbred. So predators for coyotes would be an animal that usually doesn't exist around humans well. Does that make sense? It's kind of a long sentence there. Do you have any comments about that?
There's some great work being done by the role of top predators. I think how we mingle and how top predators interact with humans is a tricky one. Living in South Carolina, we always talk about mountain lions and how cool it would be if they were back, but the habitat here is so changed that may not be an opportunity in the near future, much like wolves across much of the U.S. So how we ultimately balance that, I don't think we have a good answer.
No, but people are starting to figure it out in places like Montana, where wolves are starting to move in more and more to agricultural areas. And here in California, mountain lions are protected, so ranchers are figuring out how to coexist with them. There's a predator-friendly eco-label that some organic farmers participate in. You could go to that website to find out more. There's also a coyote, I just saw it yesterday. If you type in Maine and coyote and predator-friendly, you'll find a website that talks about them. It's a scientist working on coyote management. There's a whole section of her website about agriculture and coexistence.
Cool.
Okay, we're a transitioning organic diversified vegetable farm who focuses on diversity of crops interplanted with flowering non-cash crops. We know from theories that this is a positive habitat for certain beneficials, but what tools can be utilized to measure the biodiversity of these insects?
Well, some of the simplest things to do is when the plants are flowering, you just take a piece of white paper and tap the flower and see what insects land on there. And while you probably are not going to be able to key out that it's a predatory, which kind of predatory wasp might be there, you will be able to see that it is that organism, and or if what kinds of pests are occurring. But it's a really simple way to just look. The more we look, the more we observe, the more we'll be aware of what's occurring and keep records of it. Obviously, it's really.
Well, I would say some of the parts of the tool we're hoping to pull together will be links to resources about how to monitor, whether it's insects or birds or plants, because there are lots of tools out there for that in terms of identification and sampling techniques. If we'll provide that resource. What are easy ways to sample pollinators? What are easy ways to sample birds, so that can be included?
In our new publication, Biodiversity Conservation for Organic Farmers, in the selected resources section, there is a place for tools for farmer slash conservationist, and so you might check out those. A lot of good ways to track what you're doing out there. And John, well, I'll share those, or we'll talk about that.
Okay.
How you might include those.
Okay, I just also wanted to remind everyone, in case you are having to leave early, I noticed there are a couple people that have had to leave, that we have recorded this webinar, and it's going to be available on the eExtension website in our webinar archive, which has a very large number of other archived presentations about organic farming and research. And if you have a general organic farming question, you can feel free to use the eExtension Ask an Expert service. And I also want to mention that we're sending a follow-up survey by email later today, and we would greatly appreciate it if you could respond to that. We do have time for some additional questions, however, so I'm going to keep going with those. Are there... oh, sorry. Yeah, do you want to say something too, Joanne?
Alice, I was just going to ask you if you could go back a couple of slides. That one. I wanted to just acknowledge that there's been a lot of support in the foundation world for this work. Cliff Bar, Columbia, Frontier, Gaia Fund, Horn, Newman's Own, True North, UNFI, and as mentioned earlier, Western Stair. Not to mention all these organic businesses that have also been really important in supporting this work. So it's a community of all of us that are moving this forward. So thank you.
Okay, great. Are there benchmarks for improved or sufficient soil microbial diversity under the NOP, such as soil microbial biomass, species diversity, microbial activity, specific enzyme activities, or anything like that?
No, there isn't any. It's not like the certifier requires that they look at those parameters. It certainly would be impressive to a certifier for a farmer to track that.
Okay. What kind of hedgerow might be good to insulate an organic farm from a conventional farm that uses pesticides and herbicides?
Well, the taller the hedgerow, the better. Also, obviously, it's going to be downwind from the farm. Some kinds of plants are better than others, like big leaf plants. Sometimes the leaves turn sideways, so you want to think about what kind of leaves will intercept some drift, and the wider the hedgerow, the better too. So not just one line, but maybe 2 or 3 depending on the situation. The certifier usually helps make that decision with the farmer, so it's really good to check with them to see what they think will work.
And I'm going to post a link right now, but Jim Brandel at University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the National Agroforestry Center have an amazing set of resources around that. And that's probably one of the best resources. We're talking about specific practices. They have a lot of really helpful guides that are national in scope.
Okay, great. Thanks. Everyone should now see that in their chat box. Let's see. Should or would the NRCS assist in helping an organic farm install a fence as a method to meet Food Safety Modernization Act rules to help? Yeah.
Oh, well, I guess it depends. It seems like to me that the NRCS is all about conservation, and while they help producers get to the goal of conservation, if that is not about conservation, it's just about making the buyer feel better, when the producer can do many other things, then I would tend to say no, that's not appropriate, but it'll be interesting to see if at any time they do something like that.
Okay. Do you have any recommendations for the best book for moving toward organic certification and addressing the NOP requirements? I know there's a lot of excellent websites with that type of information from both different organic certifiers as well as the USDA NOP, who just instituted a new organic portal. So, but you may have some other recommendations, Joanne?
Oh, I was just going to say the same thing. They have a new portal and lots of great information there. I don't typically work on the whole comprehensive aspect of the regulations, so I'm familiar with what one tool is good, but there's lots of really nice new publications and little videos that help answer different questions about organic certification.
I actually have one. I'm Googling it right now. I will post the link to Amazon. So I just shared the link. This is a book written 5 years ago, kind of organized by Charles Francis. Talks about organic farming and the ecological systems. Well written. So.
Okay. Last question I think we have time for here. Do you feel that a turnkey service about restoring wildlife would be valuable for farmers? Do farmers have time to implement and design such interventions?
Well, it depends. I think organic farmers need to make time to comply with guidance with the regulations. So, but what they do, how best they do it, they often would appreciate some kind of assistance either through NRCS and or other farm/conservationists that can help them, because farmers are so busy. The more help they get, the better they're going to succeed oftentimes.
And I would also add to that, the idea of a turnkey system. And every farm is so unique that I would argue there are general principles that are applicable, but each farm should reflect the potential of that land. And so I would be reluctant to say that there is a turnkey solution. It is a little more complex than that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for all your questions. We are running out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, Joanne and John, for sharing your experience with us, and thanks to everyone for joining us today.